Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to the session 3 of the ITRC Community Practice. I hope everybody had a good week and is doing well. Before we get going, I want to just, as I have in the past, just thank all of our co-sponsors. You see all the co-sponsor names there on the logos, but I especially want to thank the American Public Health Association for providing these continuing education credits, and to the Campaign for Trauma-Informed Policy and Practice and Jesse Kohler, who's handling the logistics of the webinars. So thank you again, all of you. The first two sessions of the community practice, we tried to sort of just build a sense of what we're trying to do, why is this important, what are the basic principles involved with a public health approach to building universal capacity for mental wellness and resilience in communities. Last week we talked about how do you organize these kind of initiatives. And now for the next 6 weeks, we're going to actually dive into how do you work with people? How do you work with community members on these issues? And I'm really happy today to, and we're honored actually to have Matt Erb, the Associate Clinical Director of the Center for Mind-Body Medicine, joining us, and Vichy Jagannathan, I hope I say that right, co-founder of the Rural Opportunities Institute, both joining us to talk about how you can engage residents in practices that begin to help them heal their traumas. And we're going to get into that in a second. But as we have with all the other sessions, and we'll continue to do, I'd like to start with just a resilience pause. That is, allow you to practice a resilience skill just to calm your body, mind, and emotions, so you're just here in the here and now. And we've taught two different ones. We're going to teach grounding today. These are all from the Trauma Resource Institute's Community Resilience Model. You hear directly from Elaine Miller-Karras, who created these approaches in a couple of weeks. But I want to have you practice it today, and also in a couple of weeks, I just want you to also know we're going to teach you how to teach these to other people, because that's really critical. Imagine all these, everyone in your community, all adults and all youth, learning how to practice these kind of resilience skills, and they'll choose one. And they're all simple, self-administrable skills. That's really important. And they can adapt it to their culture, their background, their age, etc. So let's practice grounding just for a few moments. And this is about creating a sense of safety and security in yourself by being grounded on something solid. You can do grounding while you're sitting. You can do it while you're standing, leaning against a wall, walking. There's lots of different ways you can do it. So if you're willing, I'd like you just to sort of try to find a comfortable position. And then notice where your body is making contact with something solid. It could be if you're sitting, where your legs and your buttocks are sitting on the chair, and maybe your back is leaning against a chair. If you're standing, it could just be where your feet are touching the ground. If you're leaning against a wall, it could be where your back is on the wall. And just notice where you are being supported by something solid, and notice the physical sensations that exist in your body in the place in which you are being supported by that solid grounding. Just take a moment to just feel the sensations without trying to change anything. There's no right or wrong. Just notice what's there. And as you do that, you might want to notice whether the sensations you feel are pleasant, tingling, warmth, whatever, or unpleasant, pain, tension, too much heat, or neutral. You don't feel much of anything, but it's not unpleasant. Just sort of notice pleasant or unpleasant. or neutral sensations. And if your attention is drawn to unpleasant sensations, try to just deliberately shift your attention to pleasant or neutral sensations in the parts of your body that are being supported by something solid. And as you do that, just notice what's going on within your body without trying to change anything. There's no right or wrong. What's happening with your breath? What's happening with your muscles? Just what's happening in your body as you tap into and pay it and become aware of the sensations in your body in the areas where you're being supported by something solid. Okay, let's come back to the room. We'll practice grounding again, but just notice what, if anything, might not have any reaction, but just notice what that might have done for you. And now we're going to do breakout rooms. We want to just get a chance for you to connect with each other. We're going to, Neely's going to post these questions in chat, but just first start off with a check-in, just in one word if you can, how you feel right now in the present moment, what you learned or took away from last week's session, and who you shared that information with, friends, family, community members. And then discuss any outcomes or questions that emerged from last week's session or from you sharing this with somebody else. So we're going to take a 10-minute breakout room. There'll be just 4 of you max in each room, so hopefully you'll get a chance to do that. And then we're going to do another breakout room later in the session, but that's going to be a little bit longer breakout room. You'll have more time to talk. So Christy, why don't you break everyone up and get a chance for everybody to meet others. Hopefully you're meeting different people this time.
All right, everyone should be back now.
Great. Okay. Well, welcome back, everybody. I hope you had a chance to at least say hello and talk a little bit. Again, we're going to get a longer breakout room and then much more conversation going later today. I want to, let's see, how do we get this out of there? There we go. So I just want to talk for a little bit, and then we're going to hear from Matt. And I'm not sure he's on the line. I haven't seen it yet, but we developed a 6 steps process for forming and operating a resilience coordinating coalition for the climate emergency. And we're now going to be following that for the rest of the 6 weeks. Last week, we talked about step 1, organizing an RCC. This week, we're going to talk about how you begin to engage community members in building their capacity for mental wellness and resilience. And one option is to begin with trauma healing and resilience education. That's what Matt is going to talk about. And another option, and they're closely related, is how do you help them develop asset maps and a community resilience profile, that is, understand the strengths and resources they have in their community to deal with these issues. And that is what Vichy is going to talk about. And then in the next 5 weeks, we're going to go through these step 3, each one of those areas, building social connections, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the process we're going to be used. Before we jump into and hear from Matt, I want to just talk a little bit more about what this is about. And what's important to understand is both chronic and abrupt changes can be stressors for us. So let's do a stressor exercise to help you sort of understand this. And most of you do, but hopefully this will be a little helpful. So if you're willing, please add up the number of transitions, so to speak, you and your close family members experienced in the past 3 to 6 months. These are changes you had to make. It might be employment changes, income changes resulting from income changes, changes in what your kids were doing at school or doing after school, things related to pricing, how do you buy gas, how do you buy food, What kind of transitions, changes did you need to make? You and your family members need to make in the last 3 to 6 months. And put your number in chat if you can. It might be 0, might be 20. Just whatever comes up. Let's just see if you can come up with a number of transitions you make. So I see a number from 4 to 5 to 7. Yep, that's pretty accurate. Now, think about, were some of those transitions stressful? And if so, how did you or your family members cope with that? Did you get wigged out? Did you get angry? Did you take that out on somebody else? Did you take it out on yourself? Or did you laugh a lot, go play a lot just to let that stress go? How did you deal with the stress? Just think about that for a second. Now think about how many more transitions occurred in your community in the past 3 to 6 months. If you've made 6 or 4 or 7, how many more of all your community members, and how were the different residents likely to cope with the stress that they generated? Different people have different ways of dealing with these issues. Just sort of consider that. Now let's take this one step further. Now we're talking about the transition tasks changes that are needed. So select one of the transitions you identified and count the number of tasks that you had to add to your responsibilities or alter from previous times as a result of this change. And if you're willing, put that number in chat. You might have had to do 6 different things, changing different things or adding different things, adding up to 6 to make the change. Somebody said, can't count that high. Right. Molly said that. 15, etc. Too many to count. Yeah, exactly. I think everybody. Christina said 0. Great. Lots. And now think about how the additional or altered task affected you and your family. And how did you cope with those changes? Again, did you use healthy coping exercises? Did you sometimes find yourself using things like more alcohol or whatever that were unhealthy? Did you sometimes take that out on others? Did you eat too much? Did you laugh a lot? What was your coping mechanism and your family's coping mechanism? Just think that through. And now think about how many more tasks were added or altered in your community over the past 3 to 6 months, and the psychological, emotional, and spiritual effects of those additional tasks. Pretty substantial. If Christina had 577, then how many how many more were created in the community? And so I see that Jennifer said a healthy balance. Great. Okay, now we're going to take this one step further. Now multiply the number of tasks you had by the number of your transitions. So if you had 5 major transitions, but each one of those required 4 major tasks, that's a change of 20 different things. So try to sort of figure out what that number is, and then imagine what the people in your community dealt with. So just add up the number of different changes that you had to make because of the task and your transitions. And now imagine the number of transition and tasks required as the climate emergency accelerates. and the stressors and types of coping mechanisms that people might use to deal with those. And so this again is why I think it's really important to think about that and remember that the climate emergency really requires us to redefine how we've traditionally, at least in the mental health field, defined mental health and climate and psychosocial problems. We have to redefine those. What appears as mental health and psychosocial problems are usually coping mechanisms, self-protective survival reactions that started off making sense to us in our condition and where we're at, but then went awry in some way. They went wrong because they were no longer helpful or appropriate. That's how all of our coping mechanisms, we initially thought, often not consciously, that this makes sense. This is the best way to protect myself. But as we use them on and on, they go awry. Now, how do I get this to come down? Okay. Something stuck in the slide. So, what's happening? Hang on a second. Well, I'm not sure what's happening, but so when stressors and traumas are consistent and overwhelming, when they just keep happening and they're pretty overwhelming, our mind often cannot distinguish between real and false threats. And it remains in a state of hyperinflated fear. And this can cause people to fail to consider healthy options, healthy coping options, and instead adopt coping mechanisms that actually harm themselves, harm others, or even harm the natural environment. And I see that even where I live out in Oregon, where people are frightened of the climate emergency. And so what they're doing is cutting down more trees to protect themselves from wildfires, et cetera. So our fear is making the climate emergency worse. There we go. And this is really what we have to pay attention to. The climate emergency is the perfect storm. When cascading disruptions to essential systems people rely on for food, water, shelter, jobs, income, health, safety, et cetera, are mixed with disasters and they impact individuals, families, groups, and organizations, entire communities and societies can be traumatized, leading to widespread maladaptive coping. They first started to cope thinking that was the best way I could cope with these issues, but then they end up being harmful or maladaptive. When this occurs, it's really important to focus on individual and collective healing. You've got to help people heal, begin to heal, find ways to heal these traumas or they can't focus on anything else. Or if they do, they're likely going to use those maladaptive coping mechanisms to deal with them. So one approach to this is to give people skills and methods to begin healing their trauma by releasing it. And I saw that Matt joined us, and I'm very happy now to introduce Matt Erb, the Associate Clinical Director for the Center for Mind-Body Medicine, who's going to talk to you about how the Center for Mind-Body Medicine goes into communities and helps people begin to heal community members that have been traumatized. So, Matt, I'd like to turn it over to you, and thank you for joining us. It's an honor to have you here today. It's all yours.
Thank you so much. And I just want to acknowledge hearing as I came on that last slide that you had about the impacts of stress and trauma, especially prolonged, is at the heart of our work. I also want to acknowledge that our organization's based out of Washington, D.C., but I'm coming to you from Tucson, Arizona, in the Sonoran Desert, and wish to acknowledge the Pasquayaki and Tohono O'odham peoples as the original stewards of this land that I am on today and speaking to you from. Bob, do I have slide share? Yep, it looks like I do.
There you go.
Okay, can people see that okay?
Yep. Yes.
So what the Center for Mind-Body Medicine does is, over the last 30 years, an evidence-based model of mind-body medicine skills training. At its foundation, it's rooted in the amplification of awareness and a mindfulness-based model, but it's much different than something, let's say, mindfulness-based stress reduction. And I hope that'll be apparent in what I say here. There's a variety of evidence-based skills and tools that support not just self-regulation, but co-regulation, the understanding that if I don't know what I'm feeling and I'm not aware of my own physiological state, it carries direct impact on my relationships and interaction and my ability to support others through stress and trauma. And it's also built upon various avenues of self-expression, really giving people the chance to express their lived experience. And this occurs through not just things like breathing, movement, biofeedback, writing, drawing, and guided imagery, but an emphasis on a small group model that supports the collectivist and community-based or population-wide model of support. It involves an in-depth exploration of the science and biology of stress, which I just heard a bit of. Well spoken, Bob, on that. And body-mind environment interactions. It's not just individual mind-body, but it's how each of us are bathed in environments, and the influence of that environment is significant. And we call this out because we want to make sure that agency and people's sense of autonomy is appropriate to the upstream determinants of health, social determinants of health, the impact of systemic and structural challenges and patterns. And our model is train the trainer. And I often talk about the ripple effect that when individuals go through our model, they often describe long-term and lasting changes in their sense of awareness, self and self-regulation. And so beyond the delivery of groups where we train people to go into the community and lead small groups of about 10 people in the model, there's other impacts or ripple effects that we get reported over and over by participants in the work. These are some of the areas that we work in that supports public health, and I highlighted and bolded climate and natural disasters at the top. Examples include long-term programs in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, in Houston after Hurricane Harvey, in Sonoma and Shasta counties in California after the wildfires a few years back. Those are just a few examples. We also work in war and conflict. I'll show that in a moment. And a lot of work in after mass violence. We have a four-year-long and expanding program in Broward County that started with the school district after the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas school shooting, which is the largest or worst one in US history thus far. So that just gives you an example of where we work. Our research continues to grow. We have active research undergoing, but of the ones that have been done on our model, much of which the randomized controlled trials have been overseas, so they are subject to cultural factors. But in Gaza, in Kosovo, for example, we've seen 80% or greater reduction in the number of children, adolescents, and adults who qualified as having PTSD after completing the mind-body skills group. 72% of adolescents treated for depression in primary care reported that the groups changed their lives. So there were positive indicators across a number of measures. And in general, we see decreased symptomology of PTSD, depression, and anxiety, increases in sense of mindfulness, self-efficacy, reported quality of life, empathy and active compassion, and so on, and decreased burnout, particularly among caregivers and healthcare workers who are supporting often challenged populations and communities. So we have a full research and references summary that I'm happy to share with anyone if that's of interest to you. This shows you our most recent efforts to develop a program, and this is all taken over the last few months in Ukraine, as we have been offering workshops with the Ukraine-Russia war. And if you're interested in how we work in building a community project, we do continue to raise funds, emergent funds, which support the earliest stages of a co-creation with a community that's been impacted by population-wide stress and trauma, such as is occurring and is bound to continue to occur with climate change. So the need arises and presents, and we very carefully and with a collaborative approach, a co-creating approach, meet with the local experts. We consider the people who are living in that environment to be the experts. So we approach it with a stance of humility. We assist in developing the project and implementing the project. Of course, fundraising is a part of that. And then the sustainability of the project. And we have a variety of funders that have supported our work, from well-known funders like the Red Cross to smaller family foundations in the communities that we work in, who are wanting to support the community. When we train people, so you get a sense of how this works, we have 2 5-day-long trainings. So they call them PTP and ATP. Each one is 5 days. And the first one is a full immersion in the science, and then participation in the small group model, so that people can really immerse themselves in what it's like to be in a mind-body skills group. And we encourage and invite people to do their own work. That's that if we don't know what we feel, we have a harder time knowing what other people feel. And if we're not self-regulated, it impacts the physiological state of those we're working with. And then the advanced training teaches people how to lead small groups in their community. This is followed by delivery and supervision. So fundraising involves budgeting for providing people formal clinical supervision. Our model is accessible by not just licensed healthcare professionals, but by clergy, teachers, community leaders, really ultimately anyone with a good heart. Some of the studies that we did, for example, in Kosovo, was led by non-mental health professionals, almost entirely by teachers, high school teachers, and they did an incredible job leading it. We do have certification in the model available, which supports the development of leaders in the community. And the long-term sustainability. So this is kind of an overview of train, guide, and sustain when we go in and partner with communities and organizations. And basically that is my overview of what we do. And I want to open this up to see if hearing this short presentation on our work in the world brings up any questions that you'd like to know about. Then I'm going to open that up for discussion. And Bob, I invite you to chime in with your knowledge about the relevance of this, if anything you want to add as we open it up to questions.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. And this is a really helpful presentation, and we will take questions in chat. If you have some questions, post there, and Christy will read them out to everybody. But let me just ask can you give one example of how is it that your organization gets invited to go into a community? And then just like, how did you get into Kosovo? What did you do? What were the first couple of steps? And what I'm thinking is, how could people on the line, the people involved with the community practice, get your organization, as an example, invited to come to their community to help with serious traumas?
In some cases, we recognize the need and simply go on the ground. So with Ukraine, we recognize the substantial traumatic impact. And Dr. Jim Gordon, who's our founder and CEO of the organization, he just took the initiative to start reaching out and went on the ground into Poland and Ukraine and started meeting with local people. In other cases, we are invited. So in Houston, after Hurricane Harvey, where some 300,000 homes were completely flooded out. I'm sure many of you know about that. Some of you may even have lived there. We had a local social worker who had taken our training 5 or 10 years earlier, and we sent a message out from our listserv to people in Texas and said, we're interested in supporting the recovery efforts. Do any of you have connections? And this person who'd taken the training reached out and say, I do. I'm involved with the University of Texas Institute for Spirituality and Healing. and I'm also involved with the Red Cross here. Let's see what we can do. And that led to a 3-year-long training. So those are some of the top examples. It kind of comes via different avenues, but we do have a partnerships email. I guess I could have put that on, but Jennifer Pelton here is a good contact for anyone that's interested. We just field the email and begin the discussion about what's possible and look for funding leads. I feel, Bob, like I'm missing the second part of your question. Did I miss the last?
You did well, but so can you just give an example of, the first day or the first couple of sessions down in after the hurricane, how did you engage the community? What were the first couple of things community members got engaged in?
We often start with workshops. Sometimes they're just 1 or 2 hour presentations that are collaborating with local organizations. And we introduce people to skills that have been shown to help people shift their physiological state and share what they're experiencing. Those can be half or full day workshops, and those often become feeders for professionals who want to go through the full training process. They're also, those workshops are networking for fundraising as well. So people often attend from different foundations who are interested in seeing where they want to put their funds to support the community. But I would say the workshops is the biggest thing. And we have a lot of online options now available too, so we can reach places in very short notice. As in the past, prior to COVID, we worked just, in person. So it took more planning and travel. Now we can pivot and have highly effective workshops remotely when that's needed.
Great, thank you. Christy, you want to read some questions? And again, if you have any questions, please post them in chat. And I see one from Rebecca. So Christy, you want to pick those up?
We actually got a question a while back from Sumra. So we have 3 so far.
Sorry.
That's okay. From Sumra, wanted to know a bit more about the measurements and tools and instruments, Matt, that you have been using to measure outcomes in your research. And if you could possibly maybe share that summary that you had and any other measurement tools or things like you have later.
Yeah, I can get Bob a link to our research summary. Some of those are available full text, open access online, some are not. The depth, I'd have to have a list in front of me, to be honest. We have a research director, Dr. Julie Staples, who I wish could answer that question for you, to go through item by item the most sensitive instruments that we use. But we have everything from mindfulness inventories to perceived stress scale to, the classic generalized anxiety, the GAD, or the, like Beck depression inventory, these sorts of things. Literally, we have throughout probably 25 or 30 studies used a wide range of research-based measures. So, but you'll see more of that when I send you the link, and you can look up some of the papers.
Sumra says that would be super helpful, and thank you. And then we have 2 questions actually from Reb. Do you do preventative work ahead of time of a traumatic event?
Well, as is the case in public health, primary prevention is always desirable, but it rarely happens. The answer is yes. We've trained thousands of healthcare professionals in our model, which means we have people positioned all over the world who are familiar with and primed and ready to do this work. So I consider that part of it. Anticipating where trauma is going to land next is subject to uncertainty. So I don't know that we have a particular strategy to say, oh, we should, target Southwest Florida again because of their high risk of hurricanes, that sort of thing. We haven't gotten in that. Unfortunately, it's often going where the need is, where trauma has landed, and it's not just damage control, but that's the reality of it. In terms of the second question with children, our program is listed with the California Clearinghouse of Evidence-Based Programs for children, adolescents, and adults. So that we achieved that status about 2 years ago. We have a full children's curriculum, and we're continuing to expand our offerings for children and teens. We go down as young as, a couple of years old, 2-3 years old. through the teenage years, and we have specific curriculums for schools to embed this into schools, elementary schools, high schools. We even have ambassadors where teens learn to lead this work for their peers in the school. Broward County is probably the best example of that, but we have it in other school districts as well.
Great.
And thank you. And I saw someone raise their hand.
That would be me. I was interested in finding out, since the opioid addiction is across the nation, have you, in your research, done anything with the adverse childhood experiences?
The answer to that is yes. We include specific information and overviews as to the applicability of ACE's research to our model, both at the individual level, supporting us in understanding how our own individual history can impact our experience of the present, but also at the public health level. We have a number of faculty members, Tony Bankston, who has developed a large-scale program in her community in Baton Rouge. She's one of our faculty clinical supervisors and project advisors, is an ACEs trainer for her state, and weaves that in just as one example. In terms of, let's see, I missed the second part of the question. So it was ACEs and it was preceded by?
Well, the opioid
yes.
crisis.
That happens to be near and dear to my heart because I work in my clinical practice. My background is actually a physiotherapist who specializes in mental health and comorbidity. That's my second job, basically. I work with people with chronic pain. We have a multi-year sustainable project in Western Maryland that was funded by the state of Maryland comptroller, specifically to use our model to help assist with the community opioid epidemic. So that's an example. We have specific lectures and content about tailoring the work to chronic pain, for example. And we have a lot of faculty. Jose Calderon Abo, who's part-time in New Orleans and part-time in Mexico, is an addiction specialist, and he's informed the translation of our work for dependence as well as addiction situations as well.
Is that on your website?
The Maryland program is, or should be. Our new website is under complete renovation, should be up within a month or two, I believe. I think we're in the final stages of review of that, but yes, there should be information. I gave a webinar about the applicability of our model to chronic pain, for example. That's on the website. The description of the Maryland program should be on the website.
And if you could just send all that to me, we'll post it on the Basecamp program for everything.
Happy to.
And we have a couple more questions, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. From Gina, how do you engage or communicate with people or communities who are hesitant to engage in these kinds of trainings or things similar to it?
Borrowing from our one of our executive leadership team, Musadat Kazepis, she says carefully, mindfully, and respectfully. So it's a lot of listening, seeking to hear what people's experience is like and looking for the openings.
Awesome, thank you, Matt. And then we have a question from Joyce. And Joyce, I'm not familiar with the acronym, so I'm so sorry. How does the training differ from MBSR? I know Jay Gordon's work is integrative. Since you mentioned co-regulation, are you teaching polyvagal theory?
We do teach polyvagal theory within the biological underpinnings as a relevant consideration. We also teach other biobehavioral theories like neurovisceral integration, preparatory set. So that is part of the underpinnings that inform why groups are important. What's different about our work from MBSR is that it's very much collectivist, group-based model, a structure around check-in and sharing. And we include a much broader set of mind-body medicine. It's not just mindfulness, but we include guided imagery and biofeedback and expressive writing and drawing. So there's sort of a smorgasbord of evidence-based mind-body tools that may help people access their interior in different ways across time.
Thank you, Matt.
And
And
the
then,
answer to the Child Protective Services, I see that. The answer is yes. We have worked with a numerous CACs, Child Advocacy Centers. Tony Bankston, who I mentioned earlier in Baton Rouge, has been at the forefront of our work. And we also have faculty, one in particular, Margaret Gabian in Minneapolis. Her entire business is working with firemen, policemen, first responders. We've done programs. We had programs in New York City after 9/11, going back, however long ago that was, 21 years ago. So yes, we're well versed in front first responders and frontline healthcare workers and so on. And in terms of the United Kingdom, we have a faculty member in Dublin, Ireland, who's working to bring our trainings more extensively to Western Europe. We have had a couple of global trainings where we've recruited people from there. I couldn't offhand tell you how many people we have in the UK that are trained at this time, but I'm happy to put you in touch with Heidi Jackson in Dublin. She's a nurse in Dublin who's pioneering our work for Western Europe.
Thank you, Matt. This is very, very helpful. And just for everybody, again, the point of having Matt share this today is twofold. One is, in many communities, they can't engage in resilience building initiatives until they begin to heal in some way. And so starting a program like the Center for Mind Body Medicine offers is one way to begin the healing process. Then they're more interested often in dealing with other issues in the community. But if they're still just trying to protect themselves through a self-protective survival method, if you will, because they've been traumatized, it's very hard for people to engage. So that's how some community-based initiatives get going. They just start by bringing in a group like the Center for Mind Body Medicine and engage the community in that, and then things grow from there. So that's just one way to begin to engage in your community. Or even if your community is not traumatized, as I think it was Reb said, that bring in the Center for Mind Body Medicine or others that might exist and have them begin to build resilience ahead of time. Just start to train people in different skills. And I think, as Matt said very well, it's co-created with the community. It has to be, you have to find out what's relevant to community members, to residents, what they're likely to resonate with, what they're not likely, and you tailor your work around that, as I know that Matt's program does, and then you build from there. And that also might lead to the formation of a resilience coordinating coalition of some kind. You might not have that ahead of time. That might be just how you start. So you can do prevention, even though it hasn't been hit by a hurricane yet or another disaster. You can start now, and that's a way to begin to build this collaborative approach. So, Matt, thank you so much. If it's fair to say, if people have other questions, they can contact you directly. Yes, they have your email that they saw there, and you can respond. Or if you have other questions for Matt, send them to me if you don't want to do that, and I'll pass them on to Matt and get a response. So,
yeah, I put the email in there. I'll repeat the email and contact information in my follow-up email that you can distribute, Bob. And I do just want to say we deeply value when in a single individual, one of you might take interest, get trained, and become the pioneer, for that readiness, that preventative. So stay in touch.
Yeah, thank you very, very much again. And thank you for all the wonderful work you folks do. I know James is out there all the time doing great things. So thank you for joining us today and for sharing this information with everybody. So,
yep, thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Just going to take a second here to do a resilience pause, just to center yourself and let what you just heard sink in with a little grounding. Just try to find a spot, identify a place where you're being supported by something solid. And just take a moment to do that if you're willing, and notice the sensations that exist. It might be your legs and your buttocks and your back if you're sitting, or your feet if you're standing. Just Tap into those sensations that exist in places you're grounding and try to identify pleasant or unpleasant or neutral sensations. And just notice any changes that might occur in your body, anything you feel. Just notice your breath, etc., without purposely trying to change anything. Okay, we've got just a few minutes before Vichy joins us. She might already be on the line, but I just want to see any other comments that anybody wants to make in thoughts about how your community or your organization can begin to engage the people you work with in community or group-minded healing. And I think what Matt said is so important is this is not the professionals always training people or giving people skills. This is peer-to-peer assistance in skills training. Any thoughts, comments? Anybody want to offer anything? And if anybody raises their hand, Christy, please call on them. Just very quickly, could you see yourself or you're trying to organize something like this in your community or in your neighborhood?
Oh, we have Joyce who raised her hand.
I was just going to share, thank you, Bob. I know as a nurse, when I left my job very close to burnout, and listening to nurses now, that even before the healing starts, I mean, it can be basics like getting enough sleep. If you've only been sleeping 4 hours a night for, I mean, you know, so it is true. You just need to meet people where they are. And I just know for me, when I started sleeping as just a basic back in 2015, it laid the groundwork.
Great. Thank you, Joyce.
Mhm.
Appreciate that. Any other thoughts, comments? We're going to spend more time on answering this question as we go through the day, but I don't see anything else. Christy, do you see any other comments?
No comments related to your
Okay.
ask now.
So now we're going to turn to sort of a slightly different approach. One is we first started with the way how you can begin building mental wellness and resilience in a community. One is to start by giving people healing skills, resilience skills, and doing that in a peer-to-peer way. A different approach is to help people begin to understand the context causing their trauma. Help them understand the dynamics going on in their community. And I don't know if she's on the line. I can't see her yet, but I hope she is. I want to introduce Vichy Juganathan. I hope I pronounced that right, Vichy. She's the co-founder of the Rural Opportunity Network, doing some very interesting, exciting work in communities and helping them understand the context of their trauma. And Vichy, I want to just turn it over to you and have you share what you're doing.
Great, sounds good. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Can you speak a little louder?
Yep, I've been having some mic issues, so hopefully this comes through.
There we go.
But yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm Vichy. Excited to share a little bit about sort of what we've been doing in rural Eastern North Carolina, specifically around helping people kind of come together to understand our history, both of trauma and of resilience, and then try to develop solutions. So hopefully this will kind of build on what people have already been sharing as I've tuned in terms of ACEs and different types of trauma-informed interventions. So I'm gonna just share a screen here. But basically planning to walk through a little bit of background about us and our process, and then I'm happy to go into detail about anything else in the questions. But at a high level, ROI, Rural Opportunity Institute, is a just over 5-year-old nonprofit. We're a small team of 4. We work in Eastern North Carolina to support youth, organizations, and communities to interrupt cycles of generational trauma and design innovative solutions for healing and resilience. A little bit about me. I am not originally from rural North Carolina, although I have lived there now for the last 6 years. Grew up in New York, studied engineering as an undergrad, and just wasn't that interested in it. So ended up leaving a PhD program, doing Teach for America, and got placed in Eastern North Carolina. So my first introduction to the area was through teaching. That's also where I met Seth, my co-founder. We both then moved around a little bit, still working different jobs around the country, in San Francisco, New York, and just kind of could never get the region out of our heads. So got really motivated to move back and kind of partner with community members to build what is now ROI. And so a little more context about where we are. We have the great honor and privilege of living in and knowing rural Eastern North Carolina. It has a tremendous amount of history, probably way more than I ever could have imagined. As a couple of examples, Princeville is one of the first, it is the first town in America incorporated by freed, formerly enslaved Black Americans after the Civil War. Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech in a high school auditorium in our community before delivering it in Washington. The first Black woman billionaire, or Black woman to own a $1 billion private company, Janice Bryant Howard. She's from Eastern North Carolina. So there's just like tons of assets and examples of strength and resilience that I think a lot of people just don't know about, and a lot of work that's been going on for a long time. However, like people have been talking about, our region also is on the front lines of a lot of challenges, including climate change related challenges. So Princeville floods a lot. In 1999, they experienced Hurricane Floyd, and Bill Clinton visited and said this was a 500-year flood and wouldn't happen again. And in 2016, when we first moved there, Hurricane Matthew happened, and several of these photos are from Hurricane Matthew. And so that was way less than 500 years. Since then, we've seen Hurricane Florence. I've kind of packed up my stuff and evacuated several times in the last 5 years. So we're seeing an increased prevalence of these kinds of challenges. And it's not just climate related. In addition, as often happens, these things are sort of interrelated. And so if you look at some other maps, this is our community here in the green circle. This is a median household income across the Southeast. Recently, darker colors mean lower income, and you see that there's a swath of rural counties across the Southeast that struggle the most. Pull up another map. This is heart disease hospitalization, so health indicators. Again, Eastern North Carolina here in the green circle, part of a swath of rural counties across the South that struggle the most. If we had a map showing sort of natural disaster prevalence, you might notice a similar pattern. Something that people often say when they see stuff like this is that, yeah, like people in the rural South, they just make bad choices. They could do better. Never really resonated for me as a teacher, knowing my students. And if you look back in history a little more, the data says something different. And so this map, let's say you didn't look at what it was, again, looks really similar to the other ones. Eastern North Carolina, swath of counties across the rural South that seem to be struggling the most. But the difference is this is actually from 1860. So what this tells us is that these communities had the highest concentration of enslaved people across the Southeast hundreds of years ago. And now we see a host of health, educational, economic, environmental outcomes that mirror this pattern. And so our big takeaway from this is that it's not that individuals are to blame for the trauma that they're experiencing, but actually that it's systems, and that a lot of it is due to systems and policies and practices that were constructed a long time ago, often for the purposes of oppression, and have been upheld, whether consciously or not, in our systems today. And so when we brought some of this information to some of our community partners, they got really interested in saying, okay, if that's true, like what is accounting for all of these challenges we now see, and how can we better support healing? Like if it's not individual choices and actions, what is it that we can do? And so we ended up bringing together over 300 community members to kind of engage in a systems mapping process. And the goal of systems mapping was to zoom out and say, across systems, what are the higher level patterns in how we are behaving that might be perpetuating these things from hundreds of years ago that perhaps we don't agree with anymore? And if that were true, what could we do differently that might drive a really different behavior? And so this is kind of a little bit of a timeline of how we did it. We started out with a series of community interviews and workshops, tried to get, folks across a lot of different ages, locations, sectors. So this is like a high school principal and then several kids and families. And what we were doing was asking them sort of to tell broadly stories about their experience living here. When did they experience the most challenges? When did they feel supported? And what we were looking for was places where things are happening in cycles or feedback loops. And the reason for that is that a lot of dynamics can impact a problem, but oftentimes the predominant behavior is driven by feedback loops. And if we can isolate those predominant feedback loops, that's where we might be able to interrupt or strengthen and have outsized impact. So we were really trying to listen for like across what everyone's saying, where do we hear cycles? And so, these are actual like attempts at starting to draw those cycles based on what folks were saying. And so taking their individual stories and being like, hey, we've actually heard these a few times. Maybe there's more to this. Took several months, painstaking process, had a lot of support from a group called Engaging Inquiry. So if you're interested, I'd recommend checking them out. But ultimately sort of constructed these individual feedback loops and then started to say, like, how does it fit together? And trying to really make sense of like, what is the underlying behavior driving this? Here's another kind of iteration as we got a little more clear, and then ultimately managed to build basically, I mean, not a perfect, obviously it's like something that we created to understand things, but a rough draft of a map. And I can share out, or maybe through Bob, like an electronic version of this, and you can click through all the loops and stories. But essentially the way that we knew that we were sort of on the right track is we would start to show this to people and talk about different things, and they would literally touch it and trace through and say, oh my gosh, this is my granddaughter's story, or like this happened to me. And they'd be able to kind of walk their way through this map. And, we started to see people connecting to different parts of it. And a big realization was actually that there is no like one person or one system responsible for all this. Loops don't have a start and an end. And really, it's just like we're all kind of interconnected as part of it and contributing to these dynamics. And we all can potentially do something collectively to change or interrupt it once we're able to name it. And so what this kind of broad coalition, and when I say that, I mean sort of parents, families, schools, health, law enforcement, criminal justice, local government, a lot of different folks at the table. What they collectively named was that our current systems don't support healing from trauma because they segregate and isolate people away from opportunities for connection and healing. Very often when folks are experiencing their biggest challenges, they end up in isolated spaces like jails, school suspension, emergency room departments, rehab programs. Like we have these formal structures of segregating and isolating people away from connection and healing when they experience challenges. Folks get evacuated for flooding. They end up in temporary housing, homeless shelters. And so right now in that state, we are optimized to uphold that historical trauma. However, there is an opportunity to reverse that stuff once we can name it. So following that, we did a process of asking people, okay, if this is true, where can we intervene? What's the highest leverage place to instead create a community that supports people to heal, understand history, and build connections? And we kind of individually had different people interact with this on the map, but what emerged were 3 high leverage areas or loops that we could work on collectively to change things. And so that became our strategy for action. I won't talk too much about this right now, but can go deeper if people want to hear about it. The first part was increasing knowledge about trauma and how to respond, so educating people. The second one was working with public institutions to implement policies and practices that heal instead of punish. And then finally, ensuring that people, as they are on the path to healing, stay connected to opportunities for school and work. And the vision was that long-term, if we do this, those who have experienced trauma will then be in the position to provide healing for others. And so from that, couple quick highlights of what we've been able to do. We built a community accountability board. So these are residents that were nominated by their peers to hold us accountable to what we came up with from the systems mapping process. have been able to certify over 23 local community members to deliver a 2-day resilience training curriculum to over 13,000 community members. We kind of built a social innovation process modeled after design thinking, where we help public institutions identify their biggest challenges and then learn from best practices to implement more restorative interventions. And a couple of examples. One is we've been able to help a alternative high school, so where kids get sent to when they're kicked out of regular school, to hire their own counselor and bill Medicaid for it so that it's financially sustainable. And we've seen some really big decreases in suspension and disciplinary actions. And I think Matt talked about this, but we have also been able to pilot a biofeedback breathing program across a number of different spaces and seen some significant decreases in anxiety among folks who've done it. And so, yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think the advantages of this like helped us zoom out on a complex problem. Because people were part of the process, I think they were more invested in the outcome, and ultimately removed blame from any single person and helped us all kind of move together towards shared opportunity. And so, yeah, with that, I will pause to take any questions. This is my contact info and our website. Happy to follow up with anybody longer offline as well.
Thanks, Vichy. A wonderful presentation. And if you can send me, I have the systems map, et cetera, but anything else you can send, we'll post it on a base campsite we have for everybody. Let's open it up for questions that you might have for Vichy and Christy, if you want to read them, that sounds good. I see a bunch of questions, so might be a long day, Vichy.
Well, so far they've been less questions and more like comments and thanks for your work, Vichy.
Let's see. Yeah, now that I look at all that, they mostly are comments.
Yes.
And thank you for all the good work you're doing. Let me ask a question sort of just to get us started. How can you imagine, based on what you learned through this process, what would you suggest for other communities that like to start something similar to this in that what you've done? How can they begin this? Because it took a lot of work on your end learning how to do it. Any suggestions for how others can start?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's just a couple of things that helped us, especially because Seth and I are not originally from the community. So like what we were trying not to do was be the Teach for America alumni who show up for 2 years and then we're like, oh, we know exactly what it is that you should do to fix your problem. That wasn't really like our approach. And so we started by going to existing spaces where people were already convening about similar things. So there was already like the school district already had a coalition called the Mental Health Task Force. And the reason they had it was because following flooding and evacuation, they were overwhelmed by the number of students bringing, various challenges into the classroom. And so they wanted a coalition of people to work together to kind of support those students. And so we plugged into that meeting, and for a while we just listened. We were like, what are people saying over and over again? And there was like key places where they seemed to be getting stuck. So then we went to our networks to understand like, hey, they're talking about these things. Are there methodologies we could use? We came across the systems mapping process. We actually took a free online course from Acumen on it and followed that course to build the map. So the resources are out there. And a lot of it is doing workshops with people. And so we just started coming to those meetings and saying, hey, can we have 10 minutes on the agenda to do this activity? And it would be like some simple loop building activity or maybe a little brainstorm, and then we'd go back and do whatever the course said and then come to the next meeting and say, hey, you guys told us this, we built this thing, how does it sound? And honestly, just by like showing up over and over again and consistently building with people the process, I think that was how we just built momentum. Like once enough people, we didn't go in saying like we're undertaking this complicated process. We just every meeting would say, can we have 10 minutes? And that was kind of like how it built. So I think, for a lot of you, you might already be in those spaces and probably already have some traction. In that case, I think it's like using little opportunities to start this conversation where people are already gathering. And I think if they feel like they're part of the process the whole time, eventually it's like, you can't unsee it. Like once people are like, okay, this is actually what's going on, they're motivated on their own.
Awesome. Thank you, Vici. And we just had a burst of a bunch of questions that came in. And I just want to shout out to all the folks here. If you want to ask a question personally, feel free to raise your hand and I'll queue you up. And Gina, I felt that your question was answered just by what Vici was saying, but please raise your hand and if you have anything additional that you were curious about. We have a question from Octavia. How is participation incentivized, if at all?
Yeah, so we have definitely a value that people shouldn't work for free. So if we're ever doing like a interview with someone or a workshop or anything, we either ensure that they are doing it on their paid time already. Like a lot of people go to these meetings as part of their job. And so in that case, like as long as they were choosing to do it or it was already there, those people were covered. But when we invited people who otherwise weren't being paid for that time, we always offer like gift cards or allow them to invoice like however they want. So nobody works for us for free.
Awesome. And I know that your model is specifically for rural communities. Becky wants to know, do you think this could be applied to an urban area or should it be done in just one neighborhood or region of a bigger city?
Yeah, definitely think it can be done in an urban area or really any situation. I think the maybe the like important parameters are just like the ability to get a good cross section of stakeholders to consistently engage. And so I don't really, in our context, it's not hard to get the county level, like we're sort of at a county level, and it's not hard to get like the sheriff, superintendent, city council, county managers all like in a room once every 6 to 8 weeks. And that's kind of like the cadence on which we had been building. I don't know. I would imagine, like I lived in San Francisco. I'm like, that never happened. I don't think you can get those people in a room like even one time. And so in those cases, it might make sense to zero in on a more local sub area where you can sort of get everyone together. And then once something is working, maybe it's like, hey, we've come up with this. Do other people want to broaden the scope? So I think just as small or as large as you're able to like get the right stakeholders together is probably fine.
Thank you. And we have a question from Yang, who first says, thank you for being here and thank you for sharing. I would like to know if you have found some priorities or repeated problems from that loop study and map, and if you could give us an example.
Yeah, I can. Let me just quickly pull up something. While this is loading, is there another question?
Yes, yes. Philip would like to hear more about your funding model.
Great. Yeah, so we've been pretty fortunate. The first like 2 years of our work was funded entirely by one family foundation who had roots in Eastern North Carolina. They had previously funded Teach for America, and they were just like really motivated by investment. They're just like, we don't see a lot of young people choosing to live here and work here, and so they were interested in supporting us. Took a huge risk. I don't think we ever would have been able to do it without them. Once we had the map, I feel like that was way more evidence than most funders ever expect to see in terms of like, why are you doing this? And so like that initial investment really allowed us to like build this groundwork of like a ton of partners, a clear sort of theory of change. And then there were like bigger, I mean, we're still mostly funded by North Carolina foundations, but much bigger ones, like several of the Reynolds family foundations and stuff fund us. We have gotten a few contracts from state level agencies like Health and Human Services or education to kind of dig into a specific part of what they're most interested in. So I think the mapping really like changed our ability to justify what we were doing. But that first initial like 100K investment, I don't think we would have been able to like quit our jobs full time and do it without that. And then I'll just share really quick some areas of the map based on the previous question. Let me just get these Zoom windows all in the right place. Share screen. Yes. So just a couple, like, you know, you have this big map, right? And these are some of the key areas that showed up just to zoom in. One of the big patterns was around punishment. And basically the story that came up a lot was like someone would experience trauma or toxic stress and immediately would turn to some sort of coping or soothing behavior. And almost no matter what that behavior was, it's something we automatically punish. So it might be like a kid needing to step out of class to take a break. It might be using a substance. It might be some form of display of anger, like various actions. Almost always they are automatic punishment things, and then what happens is people kind of end up in these segregated, isolated places like I was naming, and they no longer have access to healthy relationships, supportive networks, additional tools for coping. And if and when they're able to leave that space, oftentimes if they're exposed to that stressor again, this pattern repeats. And so that was a really common narrative. We heard a really big one around systems of care, and that a lot of times when people do go to seek care, and this usually for a lot of our folks was in the emergency room, they are often misdiagnosed. And so they will say, I have chest pain or stomach pain, and the doctors will run all the tests and say, okay, I think you need to take this medication. And in reality, it's due to anxiety and stress. And so folks would keep coming back with recurring problems. In a younger age, very often high level of ADHD diagnosis. And when that medication did not work, they just keep increasing it. So you have kids like tracked in special ed, taking a really high prescription for ADHD medication, but still having the same challenges. So that got named. There was a pretty big story around people experience difficulties, seek help, it doesn't work, and eventually they just get tired of talking about it. And so folks start just like saying, don't even bother to bring this up because there's nothing we can do anyway. And then when there are people that succeed, like the slide I showed, like the billionaire, like Todd Gurley, the MVP of the NFL a few years ago, is from Tarboro. When there are people that make it out, they end up being used to blame everyone else. Like, hey, Todd made it, why can't you? And so like that was a really common theme. And so, okay, yeah, I guess those are the main ones. So yeah, those were some of the kind of big loops or stories that came out of the process.
Awesome, thank you. So when you share the PowerPoint with us, will we be able to zoom in like you did and look at the map like that?
Yeah, I can add those slides, but also I will, I can actually just do it right now.
And folks, we have time for one more question if anyone has any last minute queries on your mind. Oh, awesome, thank you.
What I
Bailey
dropped is
sent.
the actual like live link to the map, and so you can click through it. And you can basically, I'll show you since we're here anyway. It goes to this, and you can click on a specific story, and the narrative is here. So like, if you move around, a lot of these loops have names, and there's like a specific narrative. So there's like a whole bunch, and you can click through all of these on your own. So yeah, that's what I'd recommend, if more than the slides, if you want to kind of get the full picture.
Awesome, thank you. And y'all I'll add the link to Basecamp as well. I don't see any more questions, so I'll pass it back over to you, Bob.
Yeah, and Vici, just one other very quick question. Do you have any document on how to do the systems mapping? And I asked that because I used to teach systems thinking at the university, and once it takes a while to learn how to do it. Do you actually train people on how to do systems mapping, have a document on how to do that?
So we don't really, well, yes and no, I guess. It's a bunch of answers. So this that I just linked is the original open source online course that we took to build the map. And so I think when people ask like high level, how'd you do it? That's a great resource. They have like a big workbook. The specific part of building loops is something we have trained people on. So not the whole map, but there's an activity called upstream, downstream. And I can share the worksheet after, but you basically make like a T-chart and ask, let's say they name some challenge. They might say like, okay, a challenge related to trauma is accessing mental health. And so you write that at the top and then name all the things upstream that lead that to be a challenge. Like what makes it hard to access mental health? And then you list everything downstream that happens as a result. So if it's hard to access mental health, what happens? And you can do this activity in like 10 minutes. And people fill that stuff out. And what you start to notice across different ones is that some things are downstream on one person's, it's upstream on someone else's. And like that's showing the cycle. And so how we got to all those individual loops was just a ton of upstream downstreams. Like we'd go to like every meeting there was and ask people for 10 minutes on the agenda to do upstream downstream. We had all of their stuff and then we like put it together. So that is like a common thing we teach. I see someone talking about Vensim, which I think, yes, I have heard of people using this. The final piece that's happening is I'm working with a group out of UNC who got some funding from the CDC to work with 3 other counties in North Carolina to replicate essentially our mapping process, but in their context. And so we're just in the first year of that collaboration. But the hope is that after we have done it, we'll kind of produce our own guidebook and process for how someone could do like it's more specifically geared towards trauma and adverse childhood experiences, whereas the online course, like you can map anything. And so helping to make more of like a replicable guidebook. So not yet entirely, but in the process of trying to make it more scalable.
Great. Thank you for that. That's very helpful. I do see one more. Laura, if Christy, if you can allow Laura to speak, then we're going to have to move on here.
Thank you very much for that. It was so interesting. And when you were talking about the ADHD feedback loop, it was like my own family. So I'm from the northwest of England, which is the other end of the triangle, the cotton triangle. So where the mills were that kind of made the fabrics and so on. So I wondered if you'd thought about or knew about epigenetics with this as well. So yeah, so as well as nature, nurture, and also passing down in the biology as well. And I thought your map of slavery for the US, so that obviously the environmental toxins tend to be, you put up incinerators in poor areas, so you're kind of further embedding those injustices. Yeah, just so if you had any thoughts on that, basically.
Yeah, I think super insightful. We are learning about it. So I think when we first did the mapping process, we didn't have a ton of knowledge on that, and then got exposed to Resmaa Menakem's work and the book My Grandmother's Hands, and did like a little bit of a book study in our community and have been involved in some trainings with him. I think that really shifted how people started to think about the generational impacts and like really shifting from less of like an individual view of healing to a more collective view of healing. And so, yeah, I think we had started to enter the conversation and think there's like a ton more. So would be super open if anybody else on here has resources or if there's places to learn. Yeah, we just kind of have started to explore that ginormous iceberg. So yeah.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Vici, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for the work your fabulous organization is doing. We really appreciate it. You're making a huge contribution to the world. And we hope to keep in contact and stay together and work together on other issues. So thank you again for joining us. And we'll share all your information, and you might get a whole bunch of emails from people for questions also, and maybe some trips to England, who knows. So
I'm here for all of it. So thank you so much for having me.
Great, thank you. So let's just take a second here just to sort of come back into ourselves, do a grounding exercise, just to sort of let what we just heard sink in. Just identify a place in your body that's being supported by something solid. Tap into the feelings, the sensations that exist there. Just for a few seconds, just sort of come back to the present moment. And if grounding is something that you find helpful, you might consider practicing it 2 times a day or so, just to get used to it, and then try to teach it to someone else. Teach it to a family member or a friend, whatever, and you'll learn more about how to do it yourself, and you'll learn how to teach it. So Why don't we do breakout rooms now? And what I'd like us to do is we're going to do this for 12 minutes this time, give you a little more minute time, is share what you gained from Matt and Vichy, what you took away from that, and discuss how and if you can implement these approaches in your community or in your setting in some way. What would be needed? How could you see it happening? Or if it's already underway in some way, how could you expand it? And any issues that come up, any key points, issues, concerns, and then we'll come back and we'll have a group discussion about that. But Christy's going to break you up now into groups of 4 at the most for these breakout rooms, just give you a chance to talk about what you just heard and how you can apply it in your setting.
Everyone is back. Welcome back, everyone.
Well, welcome back, everyone. I think everybody's back. Let's just have a discussion now of key issues that came up in your breakout room, questions that you might have, etc. And you could post them in chat, or you can raise your hand if there's something that you can share. And again, really, the question that I would pose was is can you see yourself in your organization, your community, your neighborhood, or in your setting in some way, implementing or working with others to implement some version of these 2 different approaches you just heard? Is that possible? What would you need? What kind of resources, what kind of information, what kind of skills do you think you'd need to make that happen? But if there's other questions also, please bring them up. So we're going to just open it up for a few minutes, and then I want to close with things. So Christy, do you see any hands raised?
Yeah, Bob, we had a question from Lisa a while back asking about peer-to-peer approach. Is the best way to start a peer-to-peer approach to first go through some kind of training? I was looking at some of the training programs from organizations listed in the readings for this week, and they can get expensive, which is fair. Is there another way to get that kind of knowledge or experience in order to be effective when beginning to work with other individuals?
Well, let me respond first, but if anybody else has done peer-to-peer programs, please share your experience and your thoughts on that. But first of all, I think peer-to-peer training programs are really one of the absolute best ways to share resilience training skills, healing skills, and others. And yes, the best way, you have to make sure that the person sharing those skills has the training first, the skills to do it. But it's never perfect. They'll learn more as they do it. So starting off with some workshops for people and then asking them after they do the workshop, do you want to now train others and share those skills with others is usually the way that happens. And there's a number of different ways you can do it. And part of it is to try to find some funding, work with them to find funding, etc. But often, once somebody gets trained, they can start training people in their community. It doesn't cost any money. Anybody else have any experiences with that? Want to share anything? Okay, apparently not. But I would really look at the peer-to-peer approach. It's very, very important. And this is something a resilience coordinating group can do. They can talk to the different organizations, groups, et cetera. Says, anybody have skills in this? Anybody know somebody who has expertise in how to do this that you can contact and see if you can help bring us in? Or there might just be some people in the community who have already been trained and are willing to step forward, sometimes with no cost, to start training people and engage them in that kind of work. Other questions, thought, I hope that was helpful. Other issues, major points came up?
Oh, Lisa gives thanks for your comment,
Okay.
Bob. And we have a hand raised by Red. Go ahead.
In contemplating these programs, I'm feeling a little overwhelmed sometimes when I think about the breadth of my community and wanting to really, be able to affect mass change. And so what are, I hear the peer-to-peer, but just if you could maybe elaborate a little bit on, best practices or things that you've learned about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Rab, and I'll respond quickly. And if anybody else has any comments, please share also. But it can feel overwhelming, especially if you live in any sort of decent-sized town. Who do you work with? How do you start? Again, I'd suggest going back to getting a small group together, 2 or 3 people, 4 people, friends, family, colleagues, and having a discussion with them about these issues and getting a sense from them, okay, how could we start? It might be you just start by reaching out to a specific neighborhood or just a specific organization. Maybe it's the local K through 12 school or some other entity, and you start small. You develop some expertise, people begin to watch what you're doing and hear about it, and it starts to grow from there. So take it one step at a time with something that's very manageable, but get some other people involved and get them thinking about it also. And often people see what's happening and they want to engage, and all sorts of new creative ideas come up that you never thought about in the first place. That's helpful. Any other thoughts on that? How's anybody else started a new initiative in your community that seemed overwhelming initially? Any reactions to that?
Gina, go ahead.
Hi. So I recently emailed, I'm in Boston, so I emailed Boston City Hall and specifically the Community Development Department. Not really expecting a response, but they actually replied and said that they want to meet with me and discuss kind of what I had briefly mentioned in my email about kind of some resilience coalition and what that could look like in the city. So I guess based on my one experience, just kind of like sending out emails and seeing what happens can be good.
That's great. Yeah, you just never know. My experience has been in most, not all, but most communities, people are waiting, looking for some way to make major changes. Things are not going well in many places. And so often just putting some ideas out there can spur, oh yeah, let's talk about it. So you never know what'll happen. And sometimes you might have that conversation and nothing happens for 3 months, and then something else happens in the community that spurs them to get re-engaged. So thank you very much for that.
We have another hand raised from Laura.
Thank you. And I've just seen Philip's putting about the transition network, so they got really helpful advice as well. I started a sort of transition group in my area and started it by just putting a call out on Facebook for people who are interested to come and meet. And I think that's so I think that reflects some of the things we heard from Vishy as well, that you go in not necessarily know what you're doing, so you're co-developing and developing together. So we sort of came up with what we wanted to do all together, and that shaped sort of the direction of the group and come from there. I think if you don't want to end up doing all the work and leading it, then that's the way to do it. So
great. One more real quick, and then I want to wrap up for today. If there is another question, another point.
Yeah, one more from Mark.
Oh, great. Yeah, well, I just agree with what Laura said about the transition thing. And I think we stop ourselves so often because we have these ideas that we don't know what to do, or we don't have the training, or we don't have, that we're inadequate. And actually, we are all experts on our own aliveness. And if we could come together and talk about our aliveness and the aliveness in our community, we'll very quickly find ourselves knowing what support inputs we need, which is what you were saying, Bob. So I really think we don't need to hold ourselves back. We just need to start creating these crucibles of influence and creativity And like Laura was saying, holding quite lightly what I might or you might particularly think the solution is, because then we would get dragged off down a particular track. Allowing something to emerge from the collective is always much more powerful. And in my experience, when we've done this, it's actually a lot more fun too.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, and right on, Mark. I think none of us knows all the solutions. None of us can all do this. We get people together. All sorts of innovative, creative things can happen, often do happen. And we just have to allow ourselves to be open to that and actually look forward to it. It'll be fun. Oh, that went in a direction I never thought. And boy, that's interesting. And that's really helpful. So have fun with it. It can be very helpful. So I want to, with just a few minutes left, thank you for all those comments. I just want to share very quickly a couple other approaches that I've known and seen and been involved with. So one way to start one of these things is to go in and try to find a way to run some training programs, healing programs. Another is to use the Rural Opportunity Institute's approach. But you can also just start holding some conferences or workshops in your community on these issues, bring in some speakers. You can even do it online. I do a bunch of them for different communities. I just did one yesterday. And so just get them thinking about it too. And you can just take all the slides you want that we've done, develop your own slides and go start sharing that with people. Another approach is to give residents the opportunity to learn and grow by mapping their assets. And I don't have time to get into this now, but it is in the document that you should have that was sent out. You help them identify the protective factors that they think exist in their community, and then you figure out how can those be strengthened? How can you add more? And in here you'll see the slides later. There's some basic steps involved with asset mapping, but here's sort of a sample asset map from the DePaul University ABCD Institute, Asset-Based Community Development Institute. You want to identify local institutions, civic organizations, individuals that have specific skills. And you, just like a systems map, you put all those, you have them on a piece of paper where everybody can see them. And then people say, oh no, but this church is real helpful. They're not on there yet. Or this organization or this little a homeowners association is important. And you just start to engage people in mapping the assets, the protective factors that exist in their community. Then identify how can they be strengthened and expanded, how can others be added, et cetera. This engages people through a strength-based approach, not a deficit or problem-solving approach. And it can be very powerful. There's lots, you can just Google asset mapping at communities and neighborhood levels, lots of information about it. It's a very helpful tool. And then out of that, you can develop a community resilience profile. Some communities do that. I wish we had time. I'm sure some of you have done this kind of work, that you actually take the asset map and discussions you've had with different residents, and you put that into a document describing the community's existing resilience capacity, and then you start sharing that and say, how do we grow this, strengthen this, et cetera. And it's not important to actually get a document out. What's important is build the social connections between people as you're developing this kind of map. It's very common. But what I want to just remind you then is you've seen 2 examples today and 2 last week, and all of the work most of you are doing also falls into this, that we always have to remember that if trauma can be passed down through generations, then we can also do the same with healing and transformational resilience. We just have to put our focus on that rather than on always trying to fix problems, fix deficits, heal traumas, et cetera. That's all, or treat traumas, et cetera. That's all important, but we can build the capacity for people, for individuals, communities, families to heal and practice transformational resilience. So in closing, I'd just like to remind you again to please complete the session evaluation. That'll actually, I forgot to post that today, but that'll go in on the Basecamp this afternoon. I want to ask how many of you are interested in an open session on Thursday, the 10th, which would be the same time as we run this. And what an open session means is there's no set agenda. It's just a chance for all of you to come together, whoever wants to come and talk about issues that are present to them. We've already had a couple of issues that have been raised as possible discussion points, but think about that. Usually, and again, these are completely voluntary, only if you can make it and want to make it show up, but it's just a chance just to have a general conversation without an agenda. And please just send a note into Basecamp if you want to do that. You can send it right to me if you want. And then suggested homework, practice grounding once a day. And I guess I said, try to teach it to others. If you're willing and can, please share what you learned and experienced today with other people and discuss how it could be applied in your session, in your setting. And then the next session, we're going to start diving in even more. You heard a lot today from Vici and others about the importance of social connections. That is the most important foundational area that we need to focus on to build population level capacity for mental wellness and resilience. And that's what we're going to focus on next week with two really exciting programs, excellent programs. Daniel Holmesy, who runs the San Francisco Neighborhood Empowerment Network, and Howard Lawrence, who coordinator of the Abundant Community Edmonton in Canada, will share their approach to this. So it's going to be a very, very interesting day again. And with that, I just thank you all for joining us and wish you all a very good week. And please communicate with us by Basecamp if that's helpful. And we'll see you again next week. Thank you all.
Bob.
Take
Thank you,
care.
Bob. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.